So we're in week 3 of Unshakable, and this whole series has been based off of, if you missed either of the first 2 weeks, the final words of Jesus to his friends on the night before he was crucified. And Krista's done like a tremendous job of like preaching through the first 2 weeks. She was all worried and panicked about getting this right. He's like, I've never started a series before. I'm like, it's really not that complicated. But honestly, it's been really, really good, and so I'm going to try to live up to that. But believe it or not, this is actually my first time, not just preaching this series, but like in 4 weeks and 4 Sundays. And there's been a lot of different things going on, but I've been traveling the past couple of weeks to the beloved Midwest. And just this past week, I was in Nebraska, and Nebraska and New York City are not alike. And I didn't know if you knew that, but they're really just a stark contrast between the two places. And there's a lot of things that are different. But one of the areas that are different is Uber. Anyone ever ridden an Uber before? Okay, let me know my audience. All right, good. We're good. Maggie, your hand didn't go up, and you're like the biggest Uber person I've ever met in my life. You should have had like your hands up, your legs up, like, and you should have just stood up. You should be like Uber representative. So, but Uber is totally different in Nebraska than it is in New York. I mean, they still use cell phones to order Uber because they have like technology and they have Wi-Fi and stuff. But like, for instance, one of the ways it's different is like usually in Nebraska, I flew into Omaha, and usually what I found out is that the Uber driver would request that well, here, let me backtrack. What we know, Uber in New York, right? You order your Uber on your phone, and typically like 9 times out of 10, it's gonna be some sort of Toyota, like a Camry, a Highlander, or a RAV4, unless you're fancy and you get the Uber Black and you get like, the big car. But typically it's gonna be some sort of Toyota, right? And so you get that, you get in the back seat, you drive to your destination, and then you get out, like maybe you rate the person, maybe you tip them, whatever, and then you move on with your life. Nebraska, not so. Nebraska, you order the Uber like normal, but when you get to the car, the driver will ask, not that you sit in the back seat, but that you sit in the front seat, because they want to have a conversation with you. Which, like, what kind of brutal savage, like, has a conversation with a stranger? I'm like, the only thing that would make it worse is that they wanted to have eye contact the whole time. It's like, why would you want to do this? And so they ask that you sit in the front seat and they have a conversation because that helps their ratings because they're all about kindness and nice. So I guess it's like maybe more normal than what we experience, but like your expectation is I just want to sit in the back of this car, get to my destination, play a game on my phone, or do some work or whatever, and not have to talk about where I just flew in from, what New York City is like compared to Nebraska. I don't care. I know it's different, and so, I land Sunday night, a week ago. I land in Omaha. I order my Uber, and, again, it's a different kind of arrangement, but like my Uber confirms, and it's like, okay, so-and-so's coming in like a 1997 Mitsubishi Galant. I'm like, this is not a Toyota. Does Mitsubishi even is this safe? This is 22 years old. This is graduated from college. This should not be on the road at this time. So sure enough, the guy comes, he picks me up, and it looks just like you would think a 1997 Mitsubishi Galant would look like. A little bit dinged up, all the windows are down, it's like 90 degrees outside, but he doesn't have AC, so we're riding down the highway at 70 miles an hour with the windows down to stay cool, trying to have a conversation, all those things, but that wasn't even the worst of it, okay? I'm at the airport run where you pick up your passengers, he pops the trunk so I can throw my luggage in there, my backpack, and then I go, typically you shut a trunk, or you got to use a little bit of force because of the shocks or whatever they call those things in the back of the trunk that resist it from just collapsing or falling short. So I, like normal, go to shut the trunk, not realizing this guy's springs in the back of his 1997 Mitsubishi Galant do not function properly. So when I push, this thing, it slammed shut. And when I say it was like that, it was like a bang. It sounded like a gun shot went off. And I jumped. Some people on the sidewalk jumped. I'm sure 3 people took for cover, thinking someone was doing some random act of violence. Everyone was just kind of completely caught off guard, except for the driver. The driver was completely unfazed. Completely just sat in his car, didn't even, I got in, I was like, hey man, I'm really sorry. He's like, oh, no, it's okay. And everyone else is still kind of shook up and traumatized, dealing with PTSD. And this guy was completely unfazed, at ease, completely calm. And it's kind of a funny story, okay, cool story, bro. What does that have to do with the message? But I think it's a great picture for how a lot of people go through life. Because there are circumstances in life that will shake you up. There are circumstances in life that will disrupt things. There are times and situations where you'll experience something that was unexpected, and it'll cause you to kind of go into a tailspin. And there are other situations where you don't know what's going on. You just know it scares the heck out of you, and you feel like you need to duck for cover. You feel like you need to kind of run away from that situation because you don't know what exactly is happening. And yet, in the midst of those circumstances, in the midst of those situations, there are certain people like this Uber driver who can just sit still and seem unfazed when the trunk of life is slamming shut on them. Like they seem like that nothing is kind of disrupting them. They seem like nothing is throwing them off. Nothing is kind of flipping their life upside down. Even when a normal person like you or I would be in that circumstance, we would be panicked. We would be worried. We would be completely not at ease, but the exact opposite of that, and just kind of anxious and worried about what to come or what to make of the situation. And I find that kind of interesting because I think one of those things is that you have these experiences, right? Like whether it's losing a job, whether it was because you were terminated or because the company shut down or because something was changing or your portfolio or division was moving on. And so you're all of a sudden, you didn't expect that. And life is just kind of like, what do I do now? What about my bills? How do I pay my rent? Like, I got to cancel this dinner. I can't go out and do this thing anymore. Or I just spent all this money on this one thing and now all of a sudden my job changed. Or you lose a friendship or a relationship with someone. Again, it doesn't even have to be traumatic in the sense of like there was a rift or there was a problem. It could just simply be that someone that you've entrusted or someone that you cared for or someone that you've spent life with has moved on or you've moved away from them. And now the loss of that relationship feels like that was my person or that was my anchor. That was my rock. That was the person that I was building with or the person like I could go to them about anything. And yeah, I could call them. Yeah, I could text them, but it's not the same as like sitting face to face with them. And that happens and all of a sudden your life is flipped upside down. Or you find out that someone you care about or someone you love has cancer or some sort of chronic illness and you're like, that was not what I wanted to hear. And the outcome is not great, or the outcome is going to take a lot of work to make something, salvageable or go through this. I was just talking with a friend of mine yesterday or Friday, and 10 days ago, his dad had a stroke in the middle of the night. And they couldn't treat it because they don't know exactly when the stroke happened. He just woke up and realized something wasn't right. And so they say we're going to go through a year of recovery, and it's going to be at the end of this year, hopefully 90 to 90%, 95% of full function. But at the moment, his whole left side of his body is completely paralyzed and not functioning. Like, how do you deal with that? What happens in the midst of that? Or how do you kind of reconcile that? Or how do you try to figure that out? And it's all these things. It's like those things kind of disrupt us or keep us from feeling unshakable or keep us from feeling like we're steadfast or keep us from feeling like, that we're in control or that things are going to be okay. Instead, it's the opposite of that. Yet there are some people or certain people who can kind of go through that. And you look at them from a distance or maybe up close in proximity and feel like, how? Like, how are you not freaking out? How are you not worried? How are you not concerned? And I'm not talking about the person who just kind of sweeps things under the rug. I'm not talking about the person who doesn't deal with issues or the person who kind of has like this faux strength where they maybe don't really deal with something, but eventually, like a volcano, is going to explode. I'm not talking about that person. I'm talking about the person that has true strength, the person that's truly at peace, the person that you see and you look at and and you feel like it's a marvel and you just grow to admire and respect them, because how in the world could any normal person go through what you're going through and have the level of peace and stillness and tranquility in your spirit that you have? Not on the surface, but in your spirit. And I've always found that to be interesting to me because I've been in certain situations where someone should not be at peace in the way that they are given their circumstances. I've seen people deal with the loss of loved ones in ways that almost seems like unworldly, like otherworldly. Like it's just like there's no way a human could navigate that type of loss and this type of peace. And I find it interesting because at the same time, it's like it makes no sense, yet this is what Jesus said, right? What we based this whole series on. Jesus speaking, he said, I've told you all this so that trusting me, you will be unshakable and assured, deeply at peace. Now, what's interesting about what Jesus said is that this is happening. He's speaking this to his friends on the night before he would die, on the night before he would be arrested, crucified, and killed. But it wasn't just Jesus that was about to endure something. It was his friends, these guys and these women that had stayed by his side for 3+ years, journeyed with him, sacrificed everything, left family, left friendships, left jobs to pursue a connection with who was going to be their best friend, their leader, and ultimately their savior. And they're journeying with life through him. And their world was about to get flipped upside down. It was their world. I mean, Jesus was going to die and Jesus was going to go to be with the Father. He was going to be fine. But these friends of his were going to be left to deal with the ramifications and the consequences and the fear that would come when they found out if they did it to Jesus, they're going to try to do it to me. And it was in that moment, in that circumstance, in that situation that Jesus said, look, this is what's going to happen, but you will be unshakable and assured, deeply at peace. And I mean, if you think about that for a moment, what Jesus was suggesting, and maybe not even suggesting, what he was directly stating was that when life is spinning out of control, when things are kind of moving at warp speed, when things feel like your life is just tail spinning round and round, and you don't know where to go, how to get to it, how to kind of straighten things out, Jesus said that in the midst of those types of moments, you can be deeply at peace. Not just know peace, not just see peace, not just have peace, but be deeply at peace. That peace in the midst of those circumstances could become your anchor and your kind of place of solidity, the place that kind of keeps you grounded in the midst of all of that. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. I don't know if you've ever witnessed that in others. But I'm telling you, when you do, when you see it, it's mind-blowing. Yet, Jesus was saying this is available to each and every one of us. Jesus was saying this is accessible to you no matter your circumstances. This is available to you no matter your loss. This is available to you no matter your depression, no matter your anxiety, no matter your stress, no matter your worry. You can remain deeply at peace when the circumstances at life are as volatile as they've ever been. And there's a beautiful picture of this in the book of Daniel. And we'll get to the scripture in a moment, but I kind of want to set it up a little bit because Daniel chapter 3 is a story that if you grew up in church, especially as a kid, is probably really familiar to you because it tells about these three guys, three friends, called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But to kind of understand where we're going with this story, you have to kind of understand how we got here. And so Daniel 3 takes place at a time of Jewish or Israeli exile. The Hebrew people were taken captive by the Babylonian Empire and King Nebuchadnezzar, who had come in, laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, laid siege to the country or the nation of Israel, and taken captives. Those who survived, those who weren't killed, were taken back to be owned as slaves in the Babylonian Empire and in the Babylonian kingdom. But Nebuchadnezzar was smart. He wasn't just someone who came in to kill and destroy. He came in to conquer, yes, but he came in to leverage. And so he would take with any of his captives, with any of the people that that his empire would kind of take rule or jurisdiction over, he would take the best of the best and use their knowledge, their talent, and their skills for the good of his kingdom and the good of the Babylonian Empire. And so they would find and identify anyone with knowledge, young boys with knowledge, with skill, with talent, with physical gifting. And they would take those boys and place them in a training program, in a regimented training program to teach them the ways of the Babylonian Empire and then leverage that wisdom, leverage that knowledge, leverage that talent for the good of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were three of those guys who we're made aware of. Three of those guys who as a young boy or as a teenager, kind of stood out amongst their peers. And so rather than being bound to a life of slavery and kind of like brutal oppression, they had kind of a better life or a better chance to experience a better life. And these three boys kind of worked their way up the ranks to become civic leaders in the entire kingdom. And these three guys, although they were distinct in that way, they also were very distinct in their faith. Because their faith was very important to them. They were not going to sacrifice or budge on their belief in the Hebrew God versus, compromising and say, well, we'll embrace these Babylonian gods. Instead, they kind of laid firm to their position, laid firm to their beliefs. And that created some conflict. Because anytime that you live in a society where your beliefs are not compatible with the beliefs of the society, and it's not just that they're not compatible, it's that your beliefs are not going to budge or move or surrender or give yield to something else, that kind of becomes a conflict of interest. And eventually, trouble is going to come up. And that's kind of what happens. Nebuchadnezzar decides he wants to build a statue because, like all egomaniac rulers, you need to kind of recognize your greatness. And you need to recognize how good you are, how big you are, or how mighty you are, how much power you have. So he constructs this statue to himself. And he constructs the statue that at certain times of the day needs to be worshipped. It needs to be, when you hear music, anyone within earshot would have to bow down direct toward the statue and give praise and worship to this figure. And if you didn't, there was consequences. Because God forbid someone has freedom of choice. And so the consequence was you weren't just going to suffer, you were going to die. You would pay with your life. There was a furnace that had been constructed, and you would be thrown into a fiery furnace if you chose not to worship. So in a sense, if you can't get people to worship you, or if they don't going to worship you on their own, force them to do it. forced them to do it by ultimately having to decide, do I want my life or am I willing to compromise? But these three guys were unwilling to compromise. And that's where we pick up in the story in Daniel chapter 3, starting in verse 13. So I'll read a few verses and then kind of give a little bit of thought. And I want to share some things about peace out of this text. And here's where we begin. It says this: Then Nebuchadnezzar, when he found out that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't going to worship, it says, then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, let me pause for a second, because I got to give a side note, because I think this is relevant to anyone and everyone, and maybe to a specific one here today. So long as you are consumed with what people will or won't do for your favor, so long as you are consumed with what people do or don't think about you, so long as you fly into a rage anytime someone agrees or disagrees with you, you will never find true peace within your life. So long as you doubt, so long as you question, so long as your worth or your identity is based on what someone else does or doesn't do, you will never be deeply at peace. It's just incompatible. It just doesn't work. And if your identity, if your worth, if your merit is based off of what other people think or what other people do or don't do, you will never, ever find true peace in your life. You may experience it, but it will be fleeting. You may find it for a moment, but it will be passing. But so long as you fly into a rage because someone else, or you base your worth on someone else, you will never experience it to the fullest extent that Jesus promised. It goes on, verse 15. He says this, Nebuchadnezzar, I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made. And when you hear the sound of the musical instruments, but if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. I mean, you talk about a chaotic situation. You talk about a chaotic circumstance. One day you're doing your job, the next day you're fighting for your life. One day you're just doing your best and standing out among the rest, and then the next day you're contemplating, is this worth it? Not even the next day, the next moment. The moment you decide, I refuse to do that one thing. I refuse to do this. I'm going to stand by my integrity and my character, and someone else has control over the outcome of my choices. I mean, you talk about how crazy or envision how kind of a wild scenario this must have been, yet there's no hint of fear. There's no hint of panic. We read nothing of worry or distress. Instead, we see people who are confident and at ease in their circumstance. And what kind of jumps out to me is that there are really three traits in terms of like what peace looks like. Because here's peace in a situation where there should be no peace. Here's tranquility in a circumstance where tranquility should be nowhere to be found. And yet these men were able to navigate this situation in a way that any of us, we may not be thrown into a blazing furnace in a literal sense, but life can flip and upend in such a quick moment that all of a sudden we feel like our whole world is on fire. And when you look at that, you think, man, I wish I could handle a situation like that. I wish I could be that confident. I wish I could stand out like that. I wish I could acquire what they had and navigate my circumstances in the way that they navigated this circumstance. And there are three traits or three characteristics that I want to share with you that I think help kind of paint a picture of what being deeply at peace looks like. And the first thing that kind of jumps off the page is this idea of security. Idea of security. Verse 16, I'll just kind of read this for you. It says, they replied, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. We do not need to defend ourselves before you. You know what I've realized? Is that a person of peace or a person deeply at peace, they don't feel the need to defend themselves. Yet, on the contrary, someone who's not at peace will constantly and consistently find the need to defend themselves. Listen to this. Even when no one else is attacking. You have that friend or that family member. Maybe you yourself have been this person that feels like you need to justify every action. You need to defend every decision. You need to swing at every pitch. Like you have been that person or you know that person who feels like they're just incapable of remaining secure, because the opposite of security is insecurity. And insecurity is an enemy of peace. And what you realize between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is they said, listen, King, you can charge us however you want to charge us, but we do not need to defend ourselves. We do not need to go on the defense and say, well, let me explain this. Let me justify this. Let me tell you why. They didn't need to do any of that. And yet we find ourselves in circumstances where we need to kind of subtweet or post on Instagram or pick, well, people must think I haven't posted in a while, so maybe they think something's wrong. Let me post a picture of me smiling so everyone thinks everything's okay. And like no one's questioning, no one's wondering, no one's asking, yet we feel that insecurity, yet we feel that worry or that concern, or we're consumed with those moments. And we think, you know what, I need to do this. Or, well, what are they thinking about me? What are they thinking about this decision? Are they going to question this? Or why are they telling me this? Flip it on to someone else. Why are they telling me this? I never asked for that information. Because when we're insecure, we find the need to defend ourselves or explain ourselves or rationalize everything we do. I remember a few years ago, when I moved to South Carolina, I went to work for this church, and it was a completely divine circumstance of how all this stuff was orchestrated and worked out. And I'd have to share that a whole nother time. But one of the kind of remarkable things to me was that in the first 6 to 8 months, anywhere I went, every time I got engaged in a conversation, or even other times I would hear kind of through the grapevine where people were questioning, well, who is this guy? What is he doing here? How did he get here? On a kind of more humorous side, one person even thought I was just a celebrity that got hired by the church because I moved from New York, so I must be a celebrity. And so they just thought like, this guy must be a big deal. And then the truth is the opposite. But what was interesting to me was that had this circumstance or had this scenario played itself out even 6 months or a year prior, I would have found myself having to defend myself at every single corner. Well, let me tell you who I am. Let me tell you what I can do. Let me show you. Let me prove you. Let me demonstrate this. Let me do this. Let me have a conversation. And yet in this situation, in this moment, because of this journey that God had taken, and a lot of it wasn't necessarily my choice, but as much as God humbling me and helping me see that I was a nobody, helping me see that I was a broken person, helping me reveal that it was only in God's goodness would I find my security, not in my work performance, not in my identity as a Latino person, not in anything else other than Jesus, that I was able to stand secure when every situation or every conversation seemed to lend itself to an opportunity for me to defend myself. Yet the Ricky of 8 months prior would have taken the bait. And then what I realize is that a person at peace finds peace because of their security. They're marked by security. And they're marked by a security that's fueled by the second thing of hope. Hope. Verse 17, just to catch you up, it says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve, notice this phrase, is able to save us. Is able. Now, I think that's a really interesting language because they didn't say God will save us. They said God is able to save us. You see, hope is not believing that God will do something. Hope is believing that God can do something. And a lot of times we lose hope in our circumstances because we assume or expect that God will do something on our behalf in the way we asked for it, in the way we expected it, and in the time frame we gave him. And when he doesn't, oh, God failed me, or God let me down, or God disappointed me, or God bailed on me. But hope is not believing that God will. Hope is believing God can. And there's a big difference. Because believing God will is simply fool's gold. In his best-selling book, Good to Great, author Jim Collins wrote about what's now become known as the Stockdale Paradox. And the Stockdale Paradox was birthed out of a conversation that he had with Admiral Jim Stockdale, who was the longest surviving prisoner of war. He survived as a prisoner of war 8 years during the Vietnam War. Over 20 times, he was beaten, unprovoked, just beaten. Over 20 times. But it wasn't just Jim Stockdale who was a prisoner of war. He had his comrades and fellow companions who were also captives. Yet many of them, the majority of them, passed away. And so out of this conversation, Jim Collins is talking with Admiral Stockdale, and he asked them, was it obvious, was it clear as to who would live and who would die? Or how did you know? Could you get a sense or a gauge or a feel for this? And Admiral Stockdale replied unequivocally, yes, it was easy, which of course piqued someone's interest. Well, how did you know? Why was it easy? And he said, the people who I knew would die are the people who always kept saying to themselves, we're going to be out of here by Christmas. We're going to be out of here by Easter. We're going to be out of here by my birthday. We're going to be out of here by the New Year. When I get out of here by this time, I'm going to do this thing. And it was those people who had this false hope, not a true hope, but a false hope that they would be out by a certain time. And when that didn't happen, their hope would die, and a part of their soul would die, and then ultimately they would die. To the contrary, though, Stockdale said, those who survive were, and I'll share his quote with you because this is what's known as the Stockdale paradox. He says this, he says, to the contrary, those who survived was the ones who never confused faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. In other words, no matter how grim, no matter how dark, no matter how hopeless your circumstance may be, confront the reality of your situation while maintaining the faith and the hope that something can change, that something will change. But yes, you got to look at the bleakness of your situation. Yes, you got to look at the despair of your circumstances. Yes, you got to look at the darkness of your day and recognize this is not good, but I believe God is able. And I believe God can. And that's exactly what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They said, you know what? We know God is able. We know our lives are in jeopardy. We know our lives are at risk. We know we are likely to burn in this fire, but God is able. We have hope and belief that God is going to do this. And that hope was sprung or stirred by conviction. See, a person at peace is depicted or represented by security. A person at peace is depicted or represented by hope, but a person at peace is also depicted and represented by conviction. I'll go back and share this verse 18. It says this, but even if he doesn't, even if God doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. I love this because what it says is that these three guys made a public declaration of this is who we are going to be no matter what our circumstances are. It was a conviction. It was something that said, I'm going to stay placed here. I'm going to be in this position. I'm going to stand firm. Who I am is not determined or dictated by what you impose on me or what circumstances may befall me. This is my choice, and you don't have the power to take that from me. That's what conviction is. That's what drives the hope. That's what drives the security. When you say this is a choice, when I want to be at peace, I'm going to choose to be at peace. It may not be easy. I might have to fight for it. I may have to jeopardize some things or sacrifice some other things or let go of some things that are weighing me down. But this is what I choose to pursue. This is who I choose to become. And my circumstances, that illness, that divorce, that separation, that struggle, that challenge, that promotion or that loss or that financial restriction, those things do not get to choose whether or not I will experience and find peace within myself. I choose that. At the end of the day, being at peace is a proactive decision, not a reactive one. It's what you take hold of, not what takes hold of you. You see, more often than not, being at peace is having the ability to say, even if it doesn't. As Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, even if he doesn't, even if God doesn't rescue us, even if God doesn't come through, even if God doesn't show up when I need him to, even if God doesn't come in the way that I expected, even if this is going to happen, it doesn't change what I pursue or who I become. You see, even if it doesn't work out, I will maintain hope. Even if I don't get the job, I will still be steadfast. Even if the relationship doesn't pan out, I can still move forward. Even if God doesn't come through in the way I wanted, I will still have peace. Even if God doesn't do what I exactly wanted him to do, I can still trust and still have hope because God is still God and God is still good. And even if my circumstances don't work to that way, peace is not something that can be robbed or taken away unless I give that power to someone or something else. Peace is something you have within you. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego resolved with this conviction to say, even if he doesn't. The story goes on that they would be thrown into this fiery furnace. Yet, somehow, by the grace of God, 3 men were thrown into this furnace. And from afar, Nebuchadnezzar observed that there were 4 people walking. What appeared to him as a 4th person walking in a furnace that should be consuming the 3, there they were, unsinged, unburned, and unscathed. That God, in the midst of that, stepped into their furnace with them. He didn't keep them from the furnace, he entered it with them. And that's God's promise. That's what God has declared from long ago. Isaiah 43, speaking through the prophet Isaiah, this is what he says. He says, when you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. And when you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. He'd go on to say, why? For I am the Lord, your God. You see, sometimes we feel like I can't have peace if things are not stable. Or God has not let me have peace because things are rocky. Or peace is nowhere, peace has escaped me, or God has forgotten me. God's saying, no, I'm entering the furnace with you. And it's there in the furnace that you will find peace. This is what it looks like to be deeply at peace. This is the peace that Jesus said you can have. And next week, I'll show you where you can find it. Stay tuned.